When we talk about sex in narcissistic relationships, we have to start by reframing what sex actually means to a narcissistic person, because it is very different from what it means to most people in this room. For many of us, sex is about connection. It's about closeness, vulnerability, trust, mutual desire. Even when it's playful or casual, there's usually some thread of shared humanity running through it. But for a narcissist, sex is rarely about intimacy. It's about power. Sex becomes a stage. It's a performance space where they get to feel admired, desired, chosen, and in control. The act itself matters far less than the effect it has on their sense of self. How wanted am I? How impressive am I? How much influence do I have over you? That's the internal dialogue driving the behavior. And this is why people often say, but the sex was amazing. Of course it was. When someone is trying to win, seduce, dominate, or secure admiration, they can be intensely focused, charming, even intoxicating. In the beginning, that focus feels like passion, but it's not intimacy, it's acquisition. This is also why sex with a narcissist can feel so confusing. One moment it's intense and frequent, and the next it's cold, transactional, or withheld. That shift isn't random. When sex no longer provides power, when admiration fades, when a partner becomes familiar, when control feels threatened, interest often drops. The goal was never closeness. The goal was regulation of their fragile self-esteem. Once that need is met elsewhere, or once sex stops delivering that emotional payoff, it can be discarded or weaponized, and this is where many partners get stuck blaming themselves. If I were more attractive, if I were more exciting, if I did something differently. But the truth is, you were never the point. The narcissist wasn't responding to you as a person, they were responding to how you made them feel about themselves. That's a painful realization, but it's also a liberating one, because it means the problem was never your desirability, it was the framework. You'll often hear survivors say that sex felt oddly disconnected, even at its most intense. There may have been very little curiosity about your inner world, little emotional aftercare, little sense of being truly seen. That's because power-based sexuality doesn't require empathy. It requires an audience. And once you understand that, so many patterns start to make sense. Why sex could feel grand at first and empty later, why it could coexist with emotional neglect, why it could be used to pull you in and then push you away. Recognizing that sex, for a narcissist, is about power rather than intimacy is not about shaming them or romanticizing the pain. It's about clarity. And clarity is the first step out of confusion. Because when you stop mistaking intensity for intimacy, you stop handing your power away. And that awareness alone can change everything. Once you understand that sex, for a narcissist, is rooted in power rather than connection, the next layer becomes very clear. Validation is the real currency. What they are chasing isn't closeness, pleasure, or even desire in the way most people understand it. They are chasing reassurance, constant external confirmation that they are desirable, worthy, exceptional. Sex is simply one of the most efficient ways to extract that validation. For a narcissistic person, validation functions like emotional oxygen. It stabilizes them, at least temporarily. And sexual attention is especially potent because it feels primal, exclusive, and affirming all at once. Being wanted sexually tells them, I matter. I'm impressive. I still have power. That's why the pursuit can feel so intense in the beginning. Compliments are lavish. Desire feels urgent. You may feel uniquely chosen, almost elevated. But what's really happening is that you've become a mirror reflecting back the image they need to survive. This is also why admiration outside the bedroom matters just as much as what happens inside it. The way you look at them, talk about them, prioritize them, these become extensions of the same validation system. Sex reinforces it, but it's not the whole structure. And when that validation is flowing freely, the narcissist is often calmer, more attentive, even generous. People mistake this for emotional health. It's not. It's regulation. The trouble begins when validation slows down, which it always does in real relationships. Familiarity sets in, life gets busy, you express needs, you stop being endlessly impressed, and suddenly, the narcissist feels destabilized. This is when you might see a spike in attention-seeking behaviors, flirting, triangulation, compulsive pornography use, emotional affairs, or outright infidelity. It's not always about desire for another person, it's about restoring that sense of being wanted. And here's where partners often get trapped. When you notice their interest drifting, your instinct may be to give more affection, more reassurance, more sexual availability. You're trying to fix the disconnect, but in doing so, you're feeding a system that has no off switch. Because validation doesn't create security for a narcissist, it creates dependence. No amount is ever enough, and the cost keeps rising. Over time, this dynamic can erode your sense of self. You may start performing instead of relating. You may measure your worth by their attention, their desire, their approval. And because the validation is unpredictable, intense one moment, withdrawn the next, it creates a powerful reinforcement loop. That's not romance, that's conditioning. What's especially painful is realizing that the validation they seek is not about you being loved. It's about them being affirmed. Your role becomes functional, not relational, and once that role stops serving its purpose, it can be replaced, minimized, or devalued, often with startling ease. Understanding that validation is the true goal isn't about becoming cynical about love or sex, it's about reclaiming your reality. When you stop confusing validation with intimacy, you stop auditioning for someone else's approval, and that's when you begin to take your power back. Once you recognize that sex is about power and validation for a narcissist, another unsettling truth begins to surface. They are able to separate sex from emotional connection with remarkable ease. For many people, sex deepens attachment. It creates a sense of bonding, safety, and mutual vulnerability. Even when relationships are imperfect, sex often carries emotional weight. But with narcissistic individuals, sex can exist in a completely different compartment, one that does not require empathy, care, or emotional presence. This is why partners so often say, "I don't understand how they could be so intimate with me and then act like I don't exist." That confusion is real, and it's deeply painful. What you experienced as closeness may not have registered the same way for them. The physical act may have felt intense, even passionate, but it wasn't necessarily accompanied by emotional attachment. There was no merging, no shared emotional meaning. It was an experience, not a connection. This emotional separation allows narcissists to engage in behaviors that feel shocking or cruel to their partners. They may move on quickly after a breakup. They may cheat without apparent remorse. They may be sexually involved with multiple people while insisting that none of it means anything. And in a narrow sense, they're telling the truth. It doesn't mean what it would mean to you. That doesn't make it harmless. It makes it dangerous. Because when sex is disconnected from emotional accountability, it becomes easy to dehumanize the other person. Needs, boundaries, and feelings become inconveniences rather than responsibilities. Your emotional responses may be dismissed as too much or dramatic. You're left holding the emotional aftermath alone, trying to make sense of something that was never built on mutual emotional reality to begin with. This is also where many trauma bonds take root. The body remembers the closeness, the intensity, the chemical rush. The heart assumes that intimacy must equal attachment, but the narcissist's ability to detach creates a destabilizing push-pull dynamic. You keep reaching for the version of them that felt close, while they move effortlessly between involvement and distance. That inconsistency keeps you stuck, always trying to bridge a gap that only exists on one side. And again, people internalize this. They assume the emotional disconnect must reflect a personal failure. Why wasn't I enough for them to care? But the answer isn't about worth, it's about wiring. Emotional attunement requires empathy, and empathy is often profoundly limited in narcissistic personalities. Without it, sex can never become a shared emotional language. It remains a solitary experience, even when two bodies are involved. Understanding this separation is not about becoming cold or guarded, it's about accuracy. When you realize that someone can be physically intimate without being emotionally available, you stop searching for meaning where none was offered. You stop mistaking proximity for presence. And that clarity can be the beginning of freedom. Once you see how easily sex can be separated from emotional connection, it becomes clearer how it can also be turned into a tool, one that's used strategically, not lovingly. In narcissistic dynamics, sex is often not just something shared, it's something managed, given, taken away, timed, withheld. And this is where many people begin to feel destability, without fully understanding why. At first, sex may be abundant and enthusiastic. It feels affirming, exciting, even bonding. But over time, it can start to change in ways that feel subtle but deeply unsettling. Desire may disappear without explanation. Affection may dry up after a disagreement. Physical closeness may suddenly feel conditional. And when you ask what's wrong, you're often met with confusion, deflection, or blame. You're too needy, you're overthinking, nothing's changed. But something has changed. You're being regulated. With narcissistic individuals, sex can become a currency of control. When you comply, admire, or stay quiet, access remains open. When you assert yourself, set boundaries, or express dissatisfaction, sex may be withdrawn. This isn't always conscious or calculated, but it is patterned. And the impact is the same. It trains you to associate your worth, safety, and connection with their approval. For many partners, this creates a profound sense of anxiety. You may start monitoring your behavior, walking on eggshells, trying to keep the peace, not just emotionally, but physically. You may fear that saying the wrong thing will result in distance or rejection. Over time, your body learns this lesson even if your mind hasn't fully named it yet. That's how manipulation works. It bypasses logic and lands directly in the nervous system. Sex can also be used to pull someone back in after periods of distance or harm. After a rupture, conflict, or disappearance, sudden sexual intensity may reappear. This can feel like reconciliation, like closeness returning. But often, it's not repair, it's reset. There's no accountability, no emotional processing, just physical closeness that temporarily quiets the discomfort. And because it feels relieving, even soothing, it reinforces the bond instead of healing the wound. What makes this especially damaging is that many people don't recognize this as manipulation. They assume sexual availability equals desire, affection, or love. They tell themselves, if they didn't care, they wouldn't want me. But in narcissistic dynamics, sex doesn't always signal care. It signals leverage. It becomes a way to avoid emotional intimacy while still maintaining control over the relationship. And again, people turn this inward. They assume they've failed somehow, that they're not attractive enough, exciting enough, worthy enough. But the issue was never your desirability. It was the system, a system where sex was never meant to be mutual. It was meant to be strategic. Recognizing this pattern isn't about becoming suspicious of intimacy. It's about understanding when intimacy is being used against you. Because when sex becomes a tool for control, it stops being an expression of connection. And no one should have to earn closeness by giving up themselves. When sex is driven by power, validation, and control, one critical ingredient is missing, and that ingredient is empathy. Empathy is what allows two people to tune into each other, to notice discomfort, to care about impact, not just intent. And in narcissistic sexual dynamics, empathy is often strikingly absent. Not always loudly, not always cruelly, but consistently enough that something never quite feels safe or mutual. Many partners struggle to name this because nothing overtly abusive may be happening. On the surface, things can look consensual, even passionate. But when you look more closely, you begin to notice subtle gaps. Your preferences aren't remembered. Your boundaries are pushed, questioned, or treated as inconveniences. Your emotional responses after intimacy are ignored or minimized. There's a sense that your experience is secondary or invisible altogether. This lack of empathy shows up in how feedback is handled. If you express discomfort, you may be met with defensiveness or dismissal. You're too sensitive. That's not what I meant. You're ruining the moment. Instead of curiosity or care, there's irritation. Instead of repair, there's blame. Over time, you may stop speaking up, not because your needs disappear, but because it feels unsafe or pointless to express them. Empathy also involves recognizing vulnerability. For many people, sex brings up old wounds, insecurities, or emotional openness. An empathic partner moves gently in those spaces, A narcissistic partner often doesn't see them at all, or sees them and steps right through them. Your vulnerability may be overlooked, rushed, or even exploited. What should be a moment of closeness becomes another place where you feel unseen. And this is where the damage quietly accumulates. When your pleasure, comfort, or emotional safety are not prioritized, you begin to disconnect from yourself. You may perform instead of feel. You may comply instead of consent. You may tell yourself that this is just how relationships are supposed to work. But deep down, your body knows the truth. A lack of empathy isn't neutral, it's destabilizing. This dynamic can also blur boundaries around consent, not always in obvious ways, but in subtle pressures. You may feel obligated rather than enthusiastic. You may say yes to avoid conflict or withdrawal. You may override your own discomfort to maintain closeness. And because empathy is missing, these moments aren't noticed, acknowledged, or repaired. They simply accumulate as unspoken harm. What makes this especially painful is that many partners try harder in response. They become more attentive, more accommodating, more self-sacrificing, hoping that care will be met with care. But empathy isn't something you can earn by giving more. It's either there or it isn't. And when it isn't, no amount of effort will suddenly make the relationship feel mutual. Understanding the role of empathy is not about labeling someone as bad or broken. It's about recognizing whether the relationship allows you to exist fully. Because sex without empathy may look like intimacy, but it never feels like safety. And intimacy without empathy is just proximity, not connection. When you put all of these pieces together, the power, the validation seeking, the emotional disconnect, the manipulation, the lack of empathy, you begin to understand why the impact on partners can be so profound and so long-lasting. This isn't just about a bad sexual relationship or unmet needs. This is about how your sense of self slowly gets reshaped in ways you may not notice until much later. Many people leave these relationships saying, "I don't even recognize who I became." And that makes sense. When intimacy is inconsistent, conditional, or emotionally unsafe, you start adapting. You second-guess yourself. You suppress your needs. You learn to read moods instead of trusting your instincts. Over time, that constant self-monitoring can erode your confidence and distort your understanding of what healthy intimacy even looks like. One of the most common after effects is shame. People feel embarrassed for staying, for wanting the person, for missing the intensity of the sex even after recognizing how harmful the relationship was. But that shame doesn't belong to you. What you experienced wasn't weakness, it was conditioning, intermittent reinforcement, emotional unpredictability, and physical closeness create powerful trauma bonds. The body remembers what the mind is trying to forget. There's also grief, real grief. Not just for the relationship, but for the version of intimacy you thought you had or hoped could exist. Many partners mourn the fantasy, the moments when things felt close, when the chemistry was undeniable, when it seemed like maybe, just maybe, this time it would turn into something safe. Letting go of that hope can be more painful than letting go of the person. And then there's the impact on future relationships. Survivors may struggle with trust, desire, or emotional openness. Sex may feel disconnected, anxiety-provoking, or oddly empty. Or it may feel charged with pressure, like it has to mean something, fix something, or prove something. These are not personal failures. They are nervous system responses to an environment where intimacy wasn't safe or consistent. What's especially important to understand is that healing isn't about becoming less open or less loving. It's about recalibrating your internal compass. Learning to distinguish intensity from intimacy. Learning that consistency is not boring, it's regulating. Learning that desire without empathy is not connection. These insights take time, patience, and often support, but they are absolutely possible. And here's the part I want to be very clear about. None of this means you were broken going in, and none of it means you're broken now. The fact that you wanted closeness, believed in connection, and responded to intimacy means your system was working exactly as it should. The harm came from being in a dynamic where those very strengths were exploited. The work of recovery is not about blaming yourself. It's about reclaiming yourself, reclaiming your body, reclaiming your boundaries, reclaiming your definition of intimacy on your own terms. Because real intimacy doesn't leave you doubting your worth, it helps you remember it.